the aperture field, a place for seeing clearly and thinking about what matters. This is Carrie Lamott, reading It's Often Not the Loud Changes That Matter Most, It's the Quiet Withdrawals, the things that disappear before we fully understood what they were holding in place. I was recently part of a group of senior women leaders who were brought together to explore what feels today like a system that hasn't really found its equilibrium around inclusion and diversity of thought. These were women who came in with an array of battle scars, but matched with open hearts, and the aim was to make sense of what they were seeing collectively. And there were a lot of important observations that were made in that session, one of which was that representation of women on boards is, while it's holding at 30% globally, new placements have slowed significantly. And at the same time, a lot of women seem to be opting out of these systems that don't recognize or integrate their perspective. After the meeting, Katrina Foster published a piece that I thought was really interesting. She's naming something that's pretty subtle, but it's really significant as well. And that's that this doesn't really look like a loud reversal. It's kind of more like a quiet withdrawal. And so the language of DEI and the measurements and the scaffolding that once made inequality visible are slowly being removed. And I found myself sitting with a slightly different question. The signal she's pointing to feels real, but why is this happening now in a time where we might assume that we know better? I've spent decades in various ways pushing against systems as a woman in leadership, and also as someone trying to introduce new ideas into rigid structures. And for a long time, I understood that experience as kind of a battle. There was always a ceiling, and my instinct was to locate the source of it, who's blocking it, who needs to be challenged, and where does that resistance live. And let me tell you, I can play that role well. Give me a sword, and I will go to battle without hesitation. But over time, as I ran into deeper and deeper ceilings, something began to shift. Each time I reached what I thought was the final boss, I'd find some unexpected twist. The person I thought I was fighting with was usually operating within the constraints of their own, an incentive structure, a rule set, or pressures that I hadn't fully seen before then. And when I followed that thread further, the shape of the problem itself changed. It became harder to find a singular bad actor or an evil villain, and easier to see something more diffuse, systems of incentives and structures that produce outcomes regardless of the individuals sitting inside of them. And that realization didn't make that experience any easier. If anything, it made it more disorienting, because while I was trying to understand the system more deeply by listening, integrating perspectives, and questioning my own assumptions, I was still inside of it. I was still being shaped by it, and at times I was still getting hit by it. It kind of felt like holding a sword and a shield at the same time as extending an olive branch. But eventually a different lens began to emerge. Years ago, Jeremy Rifkin in The Empathic Civilization wrote about how societies evolve through expanding circles of identification, and how what we consider us grows over time from family to tribe to village to nation. And at each stage, something new emerges that stretches the boundaries of the existing system. And that creates friction, because integrating something new often requires changing something that already works, well, at least for some. And beneath that friction is something deeper than ideology, and that's fear. And by fear, I don't mean ideological disagreement or even resistance to progress necessarily, but more of a fundamental uncertainty. If we change this system, will we still be safe within it? And history gives us examples in every direction in the moments where integration created something more coherent, and also moments where it fractured what was already working. If you look at systems over time, there's a definite pattern that starts to emerge. An insight arises, often from lived experience and often ahead of its time. A system forms around that insight, attempting to bring it in reality. And then that system becomes codified into policies and metrics and language and programs. And then slowly it shifts. The form is still there, but the spirit of it begins to thin. The incentives distort, and what began as clarity becomes compliance. And what began as truth becomes language. And when that happens, legitimacy begins to erode. And it's possible that some of what we now call DEI has followed this arc. The original signal was real, and it still is. The need to make an inequality visible by naming and measuring it was necessary. But over time, many of the systems built around that signal didn't produce the outcomes they were designed to create. And in some cases, they became performative. And in others, they created friction with the other parts of the system they were trying to change. And when systems lose legitimacy, they're often not refined. They're completely abandoned. And we can see the symptoms of that now. In some places, it shows up as quiet institutional withdrawal where programs disappear, language softens, and measurement declines. In other places, it shows up very differently as more heightened or even mythic interpretations of what is happening. And these attempt to make sense of complexity by locating a central force, a clear antagonist or big boss, or a story that can hold the scale of the shift. When systems lose coherence, the signals don't arrive cleanly. There's a real risk in this moment. As Katrina points out, when we remove the scaffolding or the measurement and language, we lose the visibility. And without visibility, inequality doesn't disappear. It just becomes harder to see and harder to act on. But there's another risk as well. If we only focus on preserving the scaffolding without questioning whether it was sufficient to begin with, we may continue to measure a problem without meaningfully changing it. Measurement is just a stage in system evolution. It isn't the destination. Which brings us to a different kind of question. Not how do we return to what we had and not how to remove it entirely, but what kind of systems actually produce the outcomes we've been trying to measure? Right now, we may be between systems with the old one losing legitimacy and the new one not yet formed, and that makes this feel like a very disorienting moment, but also a generative one. When systems lose coherence, we tend to respond in two ways. We either try to preserve the structures that no longer work, or we construct narratives that explain their failure, and both are understandable, but neither on their own is sufficient. As a thought, we built systems to make inequality visible. Now, as those systems begin to erode, a more difficult question is emerging. What actually produces the outcomes we've been trying to measure? This has been The Aperture Field. You can find the written version of this piece and other notes on Substack at The Aperture Field. And if you'd like to explore these ideas more deeply, there's a companion podcast where I go further into the patterns behind the work. Thanks for listening, and see you soon. Music by Pavel Bakirov.